So Lion Lager is very expressive, but it's got light hop notes, a small amount of fermentation character, and a small amount of malt character. So in my mind, more balanced than Hansa. So it's absolute balance.
Lion Lager.
So this is Lion, and this is the one that's now being made in South Africa. So some of this iconography, this particular gaping lion, this comes from some of that iconography in the West, in close to, I think, on the Rhodes Memorial in Cape Town, and some of the old pubs and stuff in the glass where you find those mirrors and stuff. This is a part of that picture called the Lion Rampant. This was
Lion
what
Rampant.
that, yeah. So this was a brand. So Anders Olsen opened. Well, he amalgamated a whole lot of the breweries along the Liesbeek River. He built the Anneberg Brewery, and he bought Letterstedt's a brewery from his widow, and he pulled them all together and made a brewery which is now part of the cornerstone of what's going on in SAB Newlands right now.
Right.
And he was making mostly ales. It was colonial ale, and there was Cape ale, and he won a whole lot of things. That was the beer of the time.
Right.
In fact, so Castle Lager in 1898 came out before so-called Lion Lager. So he was an absolute, Geist of Cape Town. He was a member of parliament. He was the Swedish and Norwegian royal family ambassador in Cape Town. And those days, I think you see, if you go look
So this is a Cape Townian beer then, eh?
Yeah, so originally, yeah. So he didn't bring out Lion Lager himself, but
Right.
he became known as the Lion of the Cape.
Right.
And he passed away, I think it was the year, either just before or the year of the beginning of the First World War. And his mates all came together and celebrated him being called the Lion, and they brought out a lager. By that stage in South Africa, all the lagering had been sorted out.
Right.
And that beer became the Olsen's Cape Brewery's part. So, I mean, so Olsen Cape Breweries and what was then SAB were two completely different organizations. In fact, before Lion Lager came out, SAB actually opened a factory in Woodstock in 1902.
Right.
So there were definitely rivals. There was quite a bit of a rapprochement a few times. So in the 1920s, SAB and Olsen's Cape Breweries both worked on trying to establish the hop farms, and they worked and did a few things together. So it was quite clear that some of the heads knew that we one day needed to come together.
Right.
But there was lots of oohing and ahhing, and the Cape being very different to the old Boer Republic, Free State and Transvaal, and yet Transvaal was rich with the gold and all that kind of stuff. Things came to a head just like post-COVID, the post-Second World War, 1945, the so-called dominions and colonies were struggling financially, and it was quite clear that they needed to come together. In 1956, SAB, Olsen's Cape Breweries, and I think Old Dutch joined up and formed the new SA Breweries, so they absorbed.
Right.
So then Lion Lager became on the table, and its iconography.
So can I say second oldest beer for SA Brewery? Probably something else missing the bit.
So we got proof of milk stout coming out we've gone through some of the papers there in Zawa Street. Was 1930s odd. So probably but unfortunately it did interrupt production of this.
Yes.
But in Botswana and Zimbabwe, they were making it even when we stopped. So we can prove continuity all the time. Yeah. So in 56, this was then became quite big in Natal, in Port Elizabeth, and in Cape Town, to the point that they then they made another version of this called Lion Ale. That was the Umbila Brewery in Durban. And that was the so-called beer that Natal made famous. And that was sort of 60s, late 60s and then early 70s. And that really became big. But then there was Whitbread came into South Africa, and they opened the Owl Road Brewery, and Louis Layton and Anton Rupert were messing around So there was quite a bit of ooh and ahhing and quite a bit of tension. And I think SAB tried to consolidate. And I think the Lion Ale went the way of, listen, guys, we've got too many rats and mice liquids in different mini breweries. Like Cape Town does too much of this, and Durban does too much of that. So they, unfortunately, Lion Ale took the first Grim Reaper blow.
Right.
And the pity of that is that I'm now 61, and I still to this day have questions from gentlemen who are my senior,
Yes.
lamenting the end of line ale. For a brand to have 50-year-old legs, I think it stopped in 1973. I mean, that's like 50 years ago. I mean, so talking about a brand in the hearts and minds of people, that's unbelievable.
That's line ale you're talking about.
Ale. And then eventually,
because the same question you're asking, people are asking, they don't find line lager anymore often.
Yeah. So what happened was in the 90s, after we brought out Castle Light, which we deliberately, with that whole low carb movement, we brought out. There was some movement in line. There was some drop off in sales.
Yes.
And line was being made in big breweries with these massive fermenters and big brews. It came a stage that, to some people's liking, it was being produced too intermittently, and therefore quality would suffer. And I believe, with all due respect, looking back, it's a pity they did that, because line was distinctive. It was slightly darker. Also had some of the succulence of Castle. We used to use deliberate priming sugar, which is sucrose.
Right.
Now, sucrose is often frowned upon as like a cheap ingredient.
Right.
But if you're using it deliberately as not a production differentiator, but a taste and a mouthfeel differentiator, I mean, that's good going. So we'd mastered that very well. So there was a big backlash when line lager was actually taken off the market. And I think SAB maybe was a little bit too aggressive and sort of, we clever and we know beer, and so therefore, Mr. Consumer, you don't. Whereas that liquid at the time would have kept a lot of medium-sized breweries going as a going concern. So it's a real pity. And we did try to make some, we tried to fix the problem. We brought out a low alcohol, looks very much like an old Olsen's can. There was a lot of white and silver and light blue. It was a line lager. We sort of waited a year or two and then brought out this sort of alternative. And you can't tell a consumer what they want. Consumer has a different kind of allegiance, and they rejected that. So when our new principals took over, we started dabbling again. This is not exactly the same as the original line lager, but it certainly, to me, is a massive improvement on that stopgap we brought in.
Right.
In fact, when we had already lost line lager, we as tasters often were able to taste the line lager still being made at Kalahari Brewery in Gaborone.
Right.
And I mean, it was the highlight of all the tastings in Johannesburg, was because these guys were brilliant. Those guys have won many overseas medals, and they are brilliant. And they made it the way because they wanted. In fact, there was a booming over border. Now, beers are not very, very expensive. For somebody to smuggle line lager in from Botswana into Mafikeng or Mahikeng, as we call it now, meant that there was certain affinity for line lager.
Right.
And I'm actually sorry that it's gone because it was. But we still own the rights. In fact, bringing this out also allowed us to keep the rights to brew it.
Right.
I think one day as a...
Once a month a year, you apparently...
I can't remember, but you can't stop brewing for too many years.
Right.
You lose the naming rights. But I believe that there's a great chance, in my head of heads, that this could be brought back as like an heirloom birthday line lager. We did something, whatever. It could celebrate something that Cape Town did with Anders Olsen or whatever. We own the recipe, we own the rights to it. Right. We know the consumers will jump in on it because we make beers to a certain gravitas. We're not going to bring out some nonsense.
So without opening this one, what could I be expecting when I wanted to try a line lager?
So in fact, we actually won a prize at African Beer Cup with line lager during one of the COVID years. So line lager is very expressive, but it's got light hop notes, a small amount of fermentation character, and a small amount of malt character. So in my mind, more balanced than Hansa, because Hansa shows none of the ester. There's a little bit of fruitiness on line. So it's absolute balance. Absolute balance.
Wow.
Unusually, the original line was not so balanced. But that thing that was out of balance was a differentiator for line. That sweetness and that darkness was so. It's not balance is not always necessary. If the thing that's out of balance is a marker that you desire,
looking for,
absolutely, yeah, absolutely.